Hi quilters, welcome to the 10th video in our series to use leftover 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. The pattern, called Spiny Peaks, needs one colorful jelly roll and one white jelly roll. I'm using my leftover black strips instead of white and my hot pink strips for the colorful strips. I'm starting by making strip sets using one black strip sewn to one hot pink strip. My plan is to use up this entire bucket of strips. Make sure you're using 1/4-inch seam allowances. The strips do not have to be whole strips. As long as the pieces are at least 4.5 inches long, you can use them. You can sew multiple shorter strips onto longer strips. I chose to not pre-press my strips before sewing them together. When I press the strip sets, I'll press them flat before I press the seam to the dark fabric. This will save me some time. I've been eyeing the black and pink strips in my bucket for a while. When I found this pattern from Moda, I knew it would be perfect for these strips. Of course, it's written for a jelly roll, but it works for leftover strips too. You can use any two colors. If there's a strong contrast between them, it will be a bold quilt. If there's not a strong contrast between the two colors, it will have a softer sort of look. That's the great thing about this quilt. Just pick two colors and start sewing. I'll leave a link in the description below for you to find the pattern to print at home. The thread color that I used for all of the piecing in this quilt top was a soft peachy pink color. I set aside enough plain black strips to make a binding for the quilt later. The only strips I didn't use were the softest pale pinks. Once all of your strip sets have been sewn together, cut them apart with a scissors and a blade saver thread cutter. I made two piles, longer strip sets and shorter strip sets. I wanted to sort them before I took them over to the ironing board. Once everything is cut apart, it's time to press all of the strip sets. Pressing is one of the most important steps to achieve a flat and beautiful quilt top. First, I'm going to press all of my strip sets flat while they're folded together, and then I'm going to open them up and press them towards the darker fabric. I usually put the lighter fabric on the bottom to make it easier to press towards the dark fabric. If the fabrics are really wrinkly, I like to use Mary Ellen's Best Press Spray to tame the wrinkles faster. I pressed my shorter strip sets first, and then I moved on to the longer strip sets. All of the strip sets should measure 4.5 inches wide. We're going to subcut all of the strip sets into squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. The squares can be cut a couple different ways. First, you can cut each strip set individually, so one at a time cut the squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Or you can layer strip sets and cut multiple layers at once. I like to layer my strip sets and cut multiple layers at once because it makes the cutting go a lot faster. When cutting multiple layers at once, make sure you double check every measurement so that you don't make multiple mistakes at once too. Because I don't want to waste any fabric, I'm going to cut my leftovers that are less than 4.5 inches wide into two piles. 2.5-inch sections that I can use to make 4 patches, and smaller than 2.5-inch sections that I'm just going to sew into random bits to make something extra for a quilt. If your strip sets do not measure 4.5 inches wide, measure all of them and see what measurement you're at. If they're all at 4.25, then instead of cutting 4.5-inch wide squares, cut 4.25-inch wide squares. As I was cutting the strip sets into squares, I would count out 10 squares and safety pin them together. This helped me count how many I had and made them easier to hold on to. To make the pattern as shown, you will need 338 squares. I think I had about a total of 380 squares, maybe a few more. So it was easy to keep track of how many I had. I just had to count by tens. When I was finished cutting, I had my pile of squares, a good amount of 2.5-inch and random units, and a very small pile of waste for my stuffing bag. Now it's time to head back to the sewing machine. The nice thing about having the squares pinned together is that if you drop the entire set, you only have to pick up sets of 10 instead of 380 odd individual squares. I removed the pins from 3 or 4 sets at a time so that I could just sew through those sets before I would unpin more. The first thing I did was set aside 3 or 4 of the bundles, so 30 or 40 squares, to use at the end when I am putting the rows together. The rest of the squares are going to be sewn into sets of 2 squares. All of the sets of 2 need to be sewn exactly the same. The visual cue that I used was that the colorful fabric, in my case the pink, had to make an L shape. So when putting the squares right sides together, the bottom square always had the black fabric on the left, and the square on top always had the black fabric leading into the sewing machine. The bottom right corner was always pink fabric on top of pink fabric. Once I knew the visual cues to look for, I could put a pile of fabric squares on the left and a pile on the right, upside down, and then just keep feeding them through the machine. I was constantly double checking to make sure that I was sewing it right because I didn't want to have to get my seam ripper out. Once you get the pattern figured out and a rhythm going, it doesn't take long to sew through that mountain of squares. If this is the first video you found in our series of videos to use 2.5-inch strips, check the description below for a link to the playlist with all of the videos. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to see more in the future. Once you've sewn all the sets of 2, cut them apart with your Blade Saver thread cutter and then head to the ironing board. Once pressed, all of these units should measure 4.5 inches by 8.5 inches. Press all of these seams the same. Press towards the square without a pieced seam. It will naturally want to go this direction. If you press correctly now, the seams in the rows will dust together, making it easier to sew later on. This quilt is put together with rows set on a diagonal. You'll work from the corner to the center, coming together in the middle from opposite corners. Each of the rows is made from an odd number of squares. The first row has 1 block, the second row has 3 blocks, and then 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, 21, 23, and finally 25. You will make 2 of each row. To make the pattern work, when you make 2 of each row, they need to look exactly the same. As I sewed each of the rows, I would press them before adding on the next row. The upper left corner is a single block sewn onto a set of 3. The bottom right corner is a single block sewn onto the bottom of a set of 3. The visual cue that I looked for when putting the rows together was that I was making L's. I would make an L with the pink fabric and an upside down L with the black fabric. Lay the corners on the floor or a design wall so you can kind of track how it's coming together. I have my first row of 1 block and my second row of 3 blocks. Now I need to make my rows that have 5 blocks. Sew the sets of 2 together and then add a single block to get your odd number for each row. I pressed each of the rows as I went along before I added it to the corner. Sometimes it's hard to tell if the pattern is coming together correctly. You either need to step back from it a little farther or take a picture of it and look at it through your phone. Just remember that all of the rows are odd numbers. I took a Post-it note and wrote all the odd numbers down on the paper and then crossed them off as I went. So that I didn't have to get up and down as much, once I started the pattern going, it was easy to see how to put it together. So I would make a bunch of rows, iron them all at once, and then I could put them together, adding on from each corner to the center. It was really fun to watch the quilt come to life as I added each of the rows. Once the quilt top is finished, you will need to trim the sides flat to be able to quilt it. I decided to add some stay stitching all the way around the edge to keep the edges from stretching. I drew a line all the way around the quilt top on the back side, a 1/4 inch away from the corners of the seams. I lined up those corners on the 1/4 inch measurement of the ruler and used a friction pen to make the marks. And then I just sewed on that line with my sewing machine and used my 1/4 inch foot all the way around the quilt. The edge of the quilt top will be a bias edge once it's cut. The stitching will help prevent it from stretching out of shape. As you sew the stay stitching in place, be careful not to stretch as you're letting the fabric feed through the machine. The pattern didn't call for a border, but this would be the spot where you could add one if you wanted to make it a little bit bigger. I thought the quilt top was really interesting and fun without a border, so I left mine as is. My quilt top finished at 73 inches by 73 inches. Once stitched, you will need to trim just beyond the stitching line. And of course, I'm going to save these little pieces, these little triangles that I'm cutting off the edge. They could be useful for something. Once I trimmed all the way around and I had flat edges to work with, I pinned it to my quilting machine, added cotton batting and a 108-inch backing, and had it quilted. It's quilted with a large loop design, and I used a hot pink thread for the quilting. The black strips that I saved at the beginning when I was piecing were pieced end to end and then used as the binding all the way around the edge. I think the black on the edge of the quilt is perfect. The quilt might be a simple one, but the design is so striking. I love this quilt. The backing for this quilt is called Splatter. That's the name of the design. It's got a black background and a bunch of different colors. The hot pink thread blends right in. I even used up all the extra little cuts. These are the 2.5-inch cuts that I made from the strip sets, and I just made a bunch of 4 patches. All the other cuts from the strip sets were random sizes, and I just sewed them together, alternating the pink and the black. For the triangle pieces that got cut off of the edge of the quilt, I just made some half square triangle units out of them, and some of them I was able to work into blocks, and some of them I just left as half square triangle units. The little triangles in the corners on these blocks made pinwheels, some that spin to the left and some that spin to the right. I'll call this quilt a success, and I didn't make a lot of progress on my fabric boxes. This is the before that I made the quilt. And then I added these strips to the pile because, of course, I'm always making new strips. And I know it doesn't look like a big change from the before picture, but the after picture, I can tell the difference that there's fewer strips in there. So all in all, a success. We hope that you'll want to hit the like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!